It was 3 a.m. when her earbuds whispered the truth. The apartment was a pale rectangle of light and silence. Outside, Houston slept under a humid black sky. Inside, the penthouse felt colder than the thermostat claimed. Margaret lay awake on the couch, a blanket thrown over her knees, a mug of coffee cold on the coffee table. A photograph of a younger Andrew and her at a ribbon cutting glinted from the mantel. 2 smiles, 2 hands on a brass plaque, and in the dark that image looked like a picture from another life. The voice that came through the monitor was muffled, casual, as if it belonged to people who thought the world began and ended behind an office door. Margaret did not recognize every cadence at first. She recognized Andrew's laugh, light, practiced. A voice she had only heard in passing on conference calls answered him. Younger, smooth, a little too sanguine. She listened, and the room narrowed to the small rectangle of sound in her ear. They were talking about timing. They were talking about the prenup. They were talking about a divorce strategy that read like a shopping list. Dates to file, ways to minimize exposure, phrases that treated assets and promises like inventory. Somewhere in the conversation, Vanessa said, almost offhand, something about the life insurance change, and where the beneficiary name would be filed. It landed with the weight of a rock. Margaret did not shout. She did not fling the earbuds across the room. She felt first a dislocating calm, the kind that arrives when a body preparing for long habit recognizes it is in danger. She sat up. The coffee tasted like wood. On the other side of the room, the bed they shared slept under a duvet she had chosen. On the opposite wall, the television displayed the city skyline through a muted screensaver. All of it, a marriage of 15 years, suddenly read like testimony. She replayed the fragment once, twice. The recording did what recordings do. It removed layers of plausible deniability. In that small private voice file, the plans were no longer a hint, no longer a rumor that could be dismissed as paranoia. They were words, sequence, intent. The thing that had been felt for months, the looks held too long in the workplace, the elusive dinners billed to a corporate card, the late hours, coalesced into pattern. The baby monitor was a small, absurd object in the logic of the penthouse, a consumer device intended for infants and for safety checks. Margaret had acquired it months earlier, in a fit of worry she would not justify to anyone. Not to Andrew, who called her cautious, nor to friends who told her to trust the person she married. The story of why it was there was not simple. The story of what it revealed was. In the dark it became a lantern, and its light cut across the neat life they had built. She moved through the apartment with a precision that surprised even her. No wails, no dramatic scenes. She gathered a few things in a small tote. A hard drive safety deposit key she'd never used, a stack of original invoices from her old design firm folded in a leather portfolio, the prenup papers she had signed years ago because a divorce had always felt like a theoretical possibility for someone else. She left no notes. She walked out into the elevator like someone going to buy milk. In the early hours, she drove to the bank. The fluorescent lights in the lobby made the place look like a set from a movie about people who needed to pretend everything was orderly. Margaret opened her safety deposit box and pulled a thin envelope from the slot. She had not been there in months, not since the house purchase, and the sight of the documents felt like finding a fossil. The prenup sat there in its crispness, margins filled with lawyerly notations and signatures. Beneath it, a recent change of beneficiary form, signed in a hand that looked disturbingly like Andrew's, a name replacing hers. She read it twice and thought for a bitter minute about the calendar of their life, the holidays, the hospital nights, the years she had delayed client work when a job abroad had asked Andrew to relocate. There was a ledger in her head that listed intangible contributions, the late-night research for his presentations, the counsels after difficult board meetings, the dinners that softened tense investors. Those contributions were not neat columns or dotted lines. They were sweat and time and counsel. On paper, the prenup was a legal instrument. On paper, the beneficiary change was a legal instrument too. Between them, Margaret felt the cold logic of being erased. She did not make a scene at the bank. She walked back to her car with the envelope like evidence from somebody else's life. In the driver's seat she called her brother, Thomas. He picked up before the second ring. He had always been the one whose ability to reduce complex things to simple strategies comforted her. As a corporate attorney, Thomas spoke in measured syllables that could both reassure and sharpen. "Don't do anything impulsive," he said, which was the precise kind of counsel Margaret needed to hear. "Send me what you have. We'll go over it." She drove straight to his condominium, because the late-night hours made a home office feel more honest than any boardroom. Thomas met her in the small kitchen with a pot of bad coffee that tasted of paper. He unfolded the envelope as if it were a map. They read the change of beneficiary line together in silence. He tapped the prenup at the clause that spelled out what would happen under certain circumstances. For the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself the kind of anger that makes hands steady rather than shaky. "You think it's clean?" Thomas said. "But this—" He put his finger on a paragraph. "Prenups are tricky. They often say separate property, but they can't just erase gains made during marriage if there's evidence of commingling or if their business interests were advanced by the other's work." Margaret listened. Legalese can be soporific. That night, it gleamed like a blade. Thomas explained the broad strokes. Not advice, but a layperson's roadmap to possibilities. He spoke of vested versus unvested stock options, of how certain bonuses could be characterized, of community contributions given her support of Andrew when he took on a role that led to promotion. He mentioned ethics complaints and the idea of involving the company, not as a personal vendetta, but as a matter of corporate governance. Companies typically have rules about the use of corporate resources, and about nepotism or misuse of expense accounts. It was not a plan. It was a set of doors they might open. "Get me every receipt you have for things that could be related to his work. Dinners, travel, anything that looks like corporate expense but had personal elements," Thomas said. "Also any emails where you helped with decks or introductions. If it's documented, it exists." She had invoices. She had a spreadsheet, old and saved under a name she never deleted. Andrew, support, Margaret. It contained lists of clients she had connected him with, nights she'd hosted partners at their home, and notes on introductions that had led to small contracts. It was, she realized, the most concrete ledger of her invisible labor. She handed it to him. "I'll reach out to a contact," he said, "but not until we have more." He hesitated. "You should hire someone to corroborate this. A private investigator who knows corporate patterns. Not for gossip, for documents." Margaret's hand closed around the leather of the portfolio. She had never imagined herself an instigator of a legal fight. When they married, the word litigation belonged to cable news, not to dinner-table conversations. But marriages change people quietly. Patience modifies temper, and in Margaret the patience had turned into a hard focus. She wanted facts. Facts cut air. By dawn, she made a different call. Patricia Reeves answered on the third ring. Patricia had a voice like a ledger, efficient, exact. She was an ex-FBI investigator who had spent a decade following money like a bloodhound follows scent. Margaret did not choose Patricia because she wanted vindication. She chose her because she wanted a professional who would treat evidence like the precious commodity it was. Patricia arrived in the form of another neat person with an old-fashioned notebook and a refusal to dramatize. The two women sat at Margaret's kitchen table among ceramic mugs and blueprints from Margaret's former design firm. The conversation was clinical. Patricia asked for names, dates, credit cards used, social media handles, any login information that could produce a timestamp, not for exploitation, but to reconstruct a trail. It would be easy, the PI told her, to draw a map out of ordinary receipts. Corporate card charges that read, "Client Dinner," could be cross-checked against geotagged photographs on social media, hotel bookings, and expense reports. HR would know if Vanessa's title had been upgraded, whether she had roomed in the corporate apartment, and whether expense policies had been bent on her behalf. Corporations bake their own records. Humans add the messy margins. Patricia did not ask how the monitor had been obtained. She accepted that Margaret had a recording, and that its content, while incendiary, needed corroboration. "A single recording," she said, "can be powerful, but what makes it persuasive is support. Receipts, photos, approvals, layers. We build layers, and the story becomes harder to deny." What followed was a montage of meticulous, not cinematic, labor. Margaret and Patricia sat at the dining table with a poker-face laptop between them. They scanned old statements. They saved PDFs of dinner receipts where the merchant column said "private dining" without specifying for whom. They found a chain of corporate card statements where one line item, an accommodations charge, coincided with a weekend that Andrew had reported as conference travel. A social media post from Vanessa that tagged an upscale restaurant on the same date became a key pixel in the montage. Patricia had an old-fashioned trick that yielded disproportionate returns: the calendar sweep. She asked Margaret for any calendar entries Andrew might have made available. Old invites, calendars he had shared with family. They cross-checked them against geotags on posts and against the corporate card entries Thomas had extracted. Where corporate expense reports assumed a business context, private posts betrayed a pattern. On a Friday in late spring, where Andrew had logged as roadshow investor, Vanessa had posted a photograph from a hotel rooftop with a caption about finally getting a moment away. The photograph's metadata placed Vanessa at that rooftop at the precise time of an expense charged to Andrew's corporate card for client hosting. Numbers and images began to accrete into a kind of slow certainty. Patricia found an HR email, blurred headers except for a thread that mentioned Vanessa's exceptional support role, and a note about an expense exception, signed off by a mid-level finance manager. It was not a smoking gun on its own. It was a stitch. The more they found, the more the recording seemed not like an anomaly but like the hinge of a door someone was opening. The monitor had been the first thing that made Margaret see, but the evidence that followed made the vision legible. Receipts told of meals. Receipts paired with posts showed companionship. HR notes hinted at preferential treatment. A corporate credit card statement showed charges described in neutral language that, when stuck together with others, read like a pattern of personal benefit funded by corporate accounts. Through these assemblages, Thomas and Patricia formed an outline of two possible boards of attack. One was private and legal. Divorce filings that sought equitable distribution, requests for emergency relief to secure assets, and forensic accounting to determine what parts of Andrew's gains could be characterized as shared property. The other was public and corporate. An ethics complaint to Richfield Energy's board, presented as a governance issue. A claim that corporate resources may have been used for a personal relationship, that conflict of interest policies might have been circumvented. Neither path promised a clean victory. Both carried risks: legal exposure, counterclaims, and the ugliness of making private matters visible in public institutions. Margaret thought about all of it with a calm that surprised her. She had a way of cataloging feelings: a small drawer for shock, a larger drawer for anger, and a workbench where she placed things she wanted to examine. That night she set up the evidence on the workbench: the monitor, the prenup, the beneficiary change, receipts, screenshots, a list she had made of the evenings she had postponed a client trip to cook a meal for Andrew before a meeting. Each piece felt like a ledger that listed obligations she had met, and obligations that she had assumed would be mutual. "People will ask why you didn't confront him first," Thomas said quietly in the study, as he sorted through their papers. "They'll wonder why you stayed. They won't know what you gave up and what you expected. But you don't owe them an explanation. You owe yourself a careful plan." There was, in that council, an ethical tension. The strategy they discussed was fierce in its precision. File for divorce, request emergency measures to freeze questionable transfers, subpoena corporate card statements, and notify the board. They would use the recording as a lever, but they would also make sure it sat among other documents that made the recording less about betrayal and more about pattern and impact. They would not seek revenge through spectacle. They would seek accountability through the structures where reputations and career trajectories lived. Patricia took the lead on building the chronological dossier, a timeline that started with minor anomalies, an expense here, a late-night email there, and accelerated to the hush and then the whisper of the recording. She coded each item with a source: receipt, geotagged post, HR mem, witness note. She had a way of speaking that made even the most invasive-sounding processes feel like forensics, not voyeurism. "Our job is to reconstruct," she said, "not to punish with rumor, but to show what the data already suggests." At the same time, Margaret encountered another revelation, one that arrived not as evidence, but as the bureaucracy of intimacy. They found in Andrew's file a change to his life insurance policy, a form that named Vanessa as the primary beneficiary. It was recent, executed with a clerk's signature and a date that made the chest in Margaret's ribs tighten. The life insurance change was not money in a bank account. It was a symbolic absolution of commitment. A life policy, in the way husbands and wives sometimes use it, is a promise. In the paper, it had become a redirect. "Do you think it's undoable?" Margaret asked Thomas in the hours when the sky outside the study was the pale gray of a nervous dawn. "It's not undoable," he said, "but it's complex. A beneficiary change is one thing. How it was executed and whether the assets were part of a marital strategy is another. There's room to argue, and more importantly, room to negotiate. These things rarely stay static once you start pulling at the threads." She thought about negotiation with the same strange mixture of dread and relief she had felt on the day she had signed the prenup. Relief at the appearance of certainty, dread at the possibility of loss. In the quiet of her brother's study, she understood that negotiation required leverage. Evidence, she now knew, was leverage. Weeks passed in the way legal weeks do. Not cinematic time, but tempo set by other people's responsiveness. HR's slow drip of redacted memos, banks requesting formal subpoenas, lawyers asking for signed authorizations. The days became a slow accretion of small victories. A matching receipt here, a corroborating text message there. Patricia lined them up like ducks on a pond. Thomas translated the accrual into legal language that made sense without needing a law degree. It was not a clean sequence. There were moments when the practicalities of living collided with the fervor of strategy. Margaret met clients, drafted emails on the runs between bank appointments and strategy sessions, and found herself taking measurements in fabric stores as if nothing had changed. She had always been someone who believed in making things beautiful. Now she was making arrangements for the possibility of severance. She cataloged her own furniture, the designs she had trademarked, the clients who had loved her aesthetic even when it cost her time. She scribbled potential budgets in the margins as if plotting a business resurrection. In the evening she replayed the recording in her head, not to save her pain but to keep the thread connecting intention to consequence taut. Patricia, who had traced many patterns of corporate misuse in her career, advised caution. "You go loud too early," she said. "You give them time to bury or explain things away. You stay quiet too long, and you risk the statute of limitations on small things or the destruction of records. Timing is critical. Timing." It became an obsession that had nothing to do with clocks and everything to do with leverage. Margaret learned a new rhythm. When to call, when to let an email sit unanswered, when to present a document to the right person. They rehearsed narratives with Thomas, who framed arguments in terms of likely corporate reactions. You inform the board, you prompt an internal review, the company freezes accounts or at least features them under inquiry. They talked about reputational risk, about the way that a corporate board moves much like a slow grand jury of public relations. It was not vengeance. It was accountability in the language of organizations. On a gray Thursday, after months of gathering, Patricia brought another file. It contained copies of corporate card charges, line items that at first glance read like acceptable travel and client hosting, but that, when juxtaposed with social posts and hotel folios, told a different story. There was a weekend in August where a conference cost 2 nights in a suite that matched Vanessa's Instagram shots. There were repeated dinner charges at restaurants Vanessa frequented. In one corner of the folder, a scanned memo from the finance office suggested an expense exception for special circumstances, the kind of euphemism corporate finance uses when it accommodates a favored employee. Patricia leaned back and let the gravity of the paper work for them. "It doesn't prove intent all by itself," she said. "But coupled with the recording and the beneficiary change, it creates suspicion of misuse. Suspicion is enough to get an internal review. Internal reviews create pressure." "You understand," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt, "that once it goes to the board, it's public within the company. It will leak. It will get out." "I do," Thomas said. "And we accept that risk." They rehearsed the public dimension carefully. Margaret did not want spectacle. She wanted proof and restitution. Still, she recognized that reputational exposure is a tool, one that disrupts privilege. The idea of the board reading a well-indexed dossier and then calling an emergency meeting had a clarity she found both terrifying and invigorating. Andrew's title, Chief Operating Officer, made the stakes high. It also meant the board would move quickly if governance issues were credible. Margaret felt the moment of choice like a hinge. Before they escalated, Margaret did one thing that felt like sanctifying an act she otherwise would have avoided. She explained to Patricia that she had been more than a spouse who cooked meals or kept a home. She had been an entrepreneurial partner in a softer sense, a woman who kept a spouse whole enough to accept promotion. She explained, in a way that made her own sacrifices visible, the list of clients she had introduced, the nights she had interrupted her own projects to smooth a crisis after a board call. Those were not always documented. They were lived. She asked for them to be witness statements, small, human accounts that could sit alongside the harder evidence. Patricia obliged, and in time Margaret's friends and a few clients provided signed notes. Brief attestations of introductions. The nights Margaret had hosted dinners where Andrew met quietly with investors. The times she had assisted with drafts of presentations. Those statements were not dramatic. They were banal, sincere, and therefore credible. They gave the ledger a human face. Through the process, Margaret discovered a strange freedom in dispassionate assembly. Pain had a place, certainly, and it was not wasted. But she found power in translating hurt into documents that meant something in a world ordered by paper. The prenup had defined terms of separation. The papers she collected and the stories people gave her allowed her to push against the prenup's tidy lines. She understood that laws and contracts are not emotionless monsters, but instruments shaped by stories and evidence. The team, Margaret, Thomas, and Patricia, built a plan. They would file for divorce. They would request emergency relief to secure any transfers of unvested stock or recent reallocations that looked suspect. They would subpoena corporate accounts where necessary, and they would lodge a governance complaint with the Richfield board. They knew the risks, counterclaims of breach of privacy, professional denunciations, and the chance that the documentation might not be enough in court. They also knew that inaction guaranteed nothing. They scheduled a Friday. Fridays have the special potency of finality in corporate calendars and in legal filings. Companies close their books, executives clear their desks, and the world pauses into a weekend rhythm that amplifies a scandal's first echo. They aimed for precision, a filing to initiate the divorce and emergency relief delivered, through a law firm, to the company at a time designed to coincide with the board scheduling its next meeting. They would present the board with evidence and an ask. Freeze any questionable transfers, investigate the use of corporate resources, review compliance with conflict of interest policies. They would, in short, bring the private into the space where reputations live. The week before the planned filing, Margaret sat on the balcony of her penthouse and watched rain rim the city lights. She held the earbuds in her hand like a relic. She thought of the early years, how Andrew had been an ambitious man who was grateful for her sacrifices, and how gratitude had softened into expectation. She thought of the life insurance form, and how such an intimate legal instrument could be altered as casually as a name written on a dinner reservation. She thought of Vanessa, too, an efficient presence in the evidence, young and moving through company hierarchies with a lightness that irked people who'd spent years building reputations. Margaret did not want to vilify her. She wanted to understand the network of decisions that allowed a private relationship to be subsidized by corporate expense. She wanted recompense for herself, not revenge. That moral boundary mattered. On Thursday evening, as they counted the documents once more, Thomas reminded her of the stakes. "You could negotiate out of court," he said. "You might even get a settlement without letting the board walk into it. But if you want to prevent the misuse of corporate resources, if you want the company to know, then you involve the board. It changes the playing field." Margaret's decision had less to do with retribution than with making the record. The monitor had told her something that could not be unheard. The ledger she had amassed turned the whisper into a public account. Whether the outcome led to financial recompense or merely reputational correction mattered less than the principle of accountability. "I don't want to ruin people for the sake of ruin," she said. "I want what's fair. I want to know the truth of what we built together and what they call his success without the ladder I helped hold." They prepared the files in a hush. Patricia compiled the cross-referenced evidence. Thomas drafted a petition that asked the court to consider emergency measures. Margaret signed affidavits, appended witnesses' statements, and watched as the stack of papers grew into a dossier that felt like a future. They hired a process server for Friday, and they assigned a trusted partner in the firm to deliver the board's submission. The work felt both surgical and symbolic. On Friday morning, Margaret woke with a tightness around her throat that had nothing to do with sleep. She dressed in neutral clothes, a coat that said seriousness without drama, shoes worn but polished. She put the earbuds into a small jewelry box, and she walked out into the world as if headed to a meeting. The city was a slab of sun and glass. Her hands did not tremble. There was a finality to the Friday air that she had not felt in months. She sat in her car outside the building that housed Richfield Energy, breathing in the exact way she had been taught to when giving presentations. Steady, measured. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she held the image of the recording, a tiny device that had revealed an unexpected betrayal and set in motion consequences that could not be undone. As the elevator hummed to the 20th floor, she heard, not in her ear, but in the hum of other people's lives, the question she had been living with for weeks. Would public accountability deliver justice, or would it only provide spectacle? That question did not resolve itself as she stepped off the elevator and into the polished lobby. It sat like a cool stone in her palm, heavy and real. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, a clerical assistant glanced up at her and offered a curl of assistance. Margaret smiled with the sort of polite reserve she had cultivated over years of client meetings. She carried the dossier into the meeting room where Thomas and Patricia waited, where the process server had arranged timing, where the board notification would be placed in an envelope, and walked into governance offices. She placed her fingers on the spine of the folder as if closing a book on one chapter and opening another. When the receptionist called, "Can I help you?" she smiled and said, "Yes, I have some documents for Richfield's board." From the corner of the room, the story of what followed would be told later in court filings and in board minutes. For now, in this small span where the world felt like a breath held, Margaret watched a door and thought of the baby monitor she had once dismissed as an ugly little contrivance. It had shown her a fault line. It had given her a voice. If you're Team Margaret, tap subscribe and stay with this story to see what happens next. They moved quickly. The law firm filed the petition at mid-morning. The process server, a quiet, efficient person, delivered a copy of the divorce petition and the emergency motion to the company's legal desk exactly at the time they had planned, an apex of choreography built on months of mundane labor. The envelope, thick with documents, sat on a receptionist's counter like a small bomb. A junior associate at Richfield took it and said, "I'll get this to legal." Later, in a conference room down the hall, an assistant's phone buzzed and the name on the caller ID, Board Secretary, flashed across a screen. The hallway smelled faintly of takeout pad thai and new magazines. Andrew's calendar for the afternoon was full of meetings. A performance review was scheduled with the CEO. The world around them continued its routines wired to the habits of professional life. The first reaction came in whispers. In an open-plan office, a rumor takes the stairwell before it becomes a headline. An envelope passed from hand to hand, then a secure email landed in inboxes marked, "For board only." Richfield's legal counsel opened the document and read the phrases they did not want to see. Emergency relief, use of corporate resources, life insurance beneficiary change, recorded conversation. It was only a beginning. The board needed time to act, to gather counsel, to decide whether to freeze cards, to call an internal auditor. For Margaret, the act of delivering the dossier and filing the petition was a slingshot that launched processes she could not fully control. It was a decisive moment, the leap from quiet collection to public claim. Andrew's phone did not ring immediately. He was in meetings, oblivious to the envelope that had entered his professional orbit. Vanessa's day began like any other, with emails to review and a calendar crowded with check-ins. They could not have known initially that someone had pulled a string that would unravel a set of assumptions about loyalty, about the sanctity of private arrangements, about the expectation that the personal and the professional could remain separate. When Margaret left the building, she did not feel triumphant. She felt tired in that bone-deep way that comes from carrying heavy truths. She had not sought spectacle. She had sought clarity and a chance to be accounted for. The monitor had given her an opening. The papers had given her traction. The world had been set in motion. As she drove back to the penthouse, the city unfolded like a long, complicated story. She passed places where she had once celebrated victories with Andrew. Restaurants and small theaters that now felt like scenes in someone else's life. The sun had climbed higher and the skies had cleared, and for a brief moment the world looked ordinary again. That ordinariness was fragile. The week that followed would test the fragility. Margaret walked into her home in a state of deliberate ordinariness. She put the dossier in a safe place and made tea that she drank without savoring it. She sat on the couch and allowed herself a rare indulgence: to think of plants. She looked at the fiddle-leaf fig by the window and felt that the ordinary act of keeping a plant alive resembled the smaller acts that had built a marriage. The watering of trust, the pruning of expectations. Those metaphors felt inadequate, but they were the best tools she had for telling herself a story that did not spin into cynicism. In the days that followed, small things began to change. Corporate emails circulated in closed channels. Accounts were temporarily flagged for review. Vanessa, whose social media had once rewarded her with canned likes and polished smiles, found her LinkedIn endorsements shifting as people paused. Andrew's calendar filled with crisis meetings. The company placed a temporary hold on questionable charges pending audit. None of these actions promised immediate restitution. None wiped away the late nights or the small, accumulating betrayals. But each step nudged the institutional mechanisms towards scrutiny. Margaret's friends sent messages that tried to calibrate support without spectacle. Some offered to cook dinners. Others offered quiet solidarity in the form of unremarked visits. She took a call from a former client, someone who had loved her early work and offered a small, immediate kindness. "If you want to come back to this, call me. We have an office and a small project starting next month." The notion of returning to work, of turning pain into the quiet mechanics of livelihood, felt, in a way, more healing than any courtroom scenario. It felt like reclaiming a part of herself that had receded over years of compromise. Still, the legal file expanded almost daily. Thomas advised on small tactical options. Patricia continued to comb records for stray charges and corroborations. Together, they were building a case that would, in time, leave traces in court filings and in board minutes, and perhaps in settlement figures. But the ledger was not yet closed. The recording had been a spark, the beneficiary change a cold fact, the prenup a boundary to be contested. The filing had lit a fuse through the corporate and legal world. For each document Margaret added to the stack, there was a counterforce: denials, plausible explanations, or the slow machinery of law and governance that could dilute momentum. One evening, in a late-hour call that seemed to constrict the space around her chest, Margaret listened as Andrew's attorney contacted Thomas requesting mediation and alleging invasion of privacy. The word privacy echoed larger in the line than Margaret expected. The attorney framed the recording as a breach, something taken in secret and used as a weapon. It was a predictable response. It was also a complication Thomas had foreseen. "We anticipated this line," Thomas said when he relayed the call. "They'll try to shift focus to method. We have to keep the narrative on misuse of corporate resources and on the material contributions you made." The procedural skirmish was a reminder that the moment between discovery and resolution is where a story is most delicate. In that space, reputations are contested, and facts are filtered through lawyers' arguments. That is the theater of legality, an arena of linear filings and lateral motions, an arena where the noise of headlines is often louder than the quiet of testimony. Margaret learned to keep her hands on the wheel of the practical. She communicated with clients, sketching plans for a relaunch of her design business that was not a fantasy, but a series of precise steps. She began to sketch a modest office plan in Austin, a place where her work could begin again small and focused. The idea of moving, literal and metaphorical, appealed to a part of her that had always thrived on construction. At night, when the house settled and the city dimmed, she sometimes replayed the recording once more, not to inflame old wounds, but to remember why she had set these processes in motion. The monitor had been sneaky in the sense that it had captured private words in a domestic seam. Yet the consequences of those words spilled farther than any private betrayal. They implicated governance, corporate policy, and a public figure who had to be accountable. It was messy. It was also, in a strict sense, the beginning of a corrective. There would be days of public spectacle and private legal wrangling. There would be negotiations that tasted of ash and relief. There would be a part of her that would grieve what the marriage had been in its best moments. There would be a part of her that would be brisk with the necessity of correction. For now, she needed evidence to remain intact and wills to remain steady. As the week rolled toward the first hearing, the emergency motion to freeze suspicious transfers, Margaret felt the weight of the next step the way a runner feels the first hill of a long race, a challenge accepted, not a foregone victory. She packed documents into a leather case and checked each item against Patricia's spreadsheet. The monitor's file sat on a separate hard drive, encrypted and duplicated. The prenup was in an accessible binder. The beneficiary change form, the receipts, the HR emails, they were all there. A constellation of data that might, if they had done the work right, tell a coherent story. The morning of the emergency motion, they drove to the county courthouse in a small caravan. Thomas and his associate bringing legal muscle, Patricia with a quiet folder of witness statements, and Margaret with her portfolio and a face that exuded the hard-won calm of someone who had decided to act. The courthouse smelled of old paper and disinfectant, and the clerks moved with the measured indifference that protects them from being dragged into the storms of other people's lives. In the courtroom they presented a stack of things that felt stubbornly human. Printouts of receipts with smudged merchant names, a calendar entry with an innocuous title that suddenly looked like a lie, a witness statement from a friend who remembered Margaret standing in a kitchen at midnight finalizing a pitch deck. Thomas spoke in a cadence that smoothed the edges of outrage into argument. Patricia, sitting near the gallery, slid an exhibit to the desk when asked and watched without spectacle as the judge scanned the file. Opposing counsel tried the predictable lines. The recording, Andrew's lawyer said, raised questions about method and privacy. The beneficiary change, they argued, was a personal decision, unremarkable on its face. The prenup, they reminded the room, had been voluntarily signed years before and created expectations that the court should honor. It was a tidy defense, procedural, polite, plausible. But the narrative the court examined was not a single incendiary act. It was a pattern. Corporate charges that aligned with private trips, a string of geotags that placed two people together at times. The calendar suggested they were apart, an internal memo that noted an exception for one employee. Thomas's careful cross-referencing made the pattern visible. The recording that had begun it all no longer stood alone. It was the hinge the rest of the evidence turned on. The judge issued a ruling that was both narrow and decisive. She granted limited emergency relief, a temporary freeze on transfers of recently exercised equity, an order that certain accounts be preserved pending further forensic accounting, and permission for targeted subpoenas to the company's finance department. The order did not decide the divorce or declare ownership of assets. It simply prevented the dissipation of items that might be subject to later adjudication. For Margaret, it was enough to steady the field. The moment the order landed, the mechanics of corporate life reacted. Richfield's legal team convened in a glassed boardroom, while outside the building people went about their days unaware. The board, prompted by the gravity of the filings and the prospect of governance exposure, retained outside counsel and launched an internal review. An auditor was assigned, expense cards were flagged. Finance froze the lines that had enabled unusual accommodations. HR placed Vanessa on administrative leave pending investigation, and within days a terse internal memo announced that the company was reviewing compliance and conduct in relation to recent filings. Andrew's public posture strained into calm. In internal memos and in a terse statement released by his counsel, he denied impropriety and framed the dispute as a private marital matter being mischaracterized in public. But the company's appetite for risk and its sensitivity to shareholder perception outweighed private narrative. In corporate governance, even an accusation can force movement. When governance is exposed to potential scandal, boards often act quickly to protect the enterprise. What followed was not a theatrically immediate collapse, but a slow, professional disassembly. The internal review found use of corporate funds that could not be neatly reconciled with stated business purposes. Some unvested options were later determined to be at risk under the company's clawback policies and were effectively neutralized before they could vest. Vanessa exited the company with a separation agreement. Andrew was relieved of certain operational duties and found his title adjusted in a way that reduced his public profile. The disciplinary language in the minutes did not scream revenge. It read like minutes. The consequences, however, were very real. Litigation, of course, does not move in the neat arcs of a script. There were hearings, depositions, and tense negotiation sessions where lawyers traded offers like cards. Margaret endured the procedural grind with the same composure she'd maintained since the discovery. She was present, precise, and unwilling to conflate justice with spectacle. Thomas negotiated the terms with a pragmatic eye. Patricia continued to verify timelines and source documents, ensuring the factual scaffolding did not crumble under cross-examination. After 11 months of litigation, periods of deadlock, a few bruising courtroom skirmishes, and a mediating session that thinned some of the edges. A settlement was reached. The terms were the product of leverage and fatigue in equal measure. Margaret retained the family home stipulated under certain prenup provisions, a secondary property that had been part of their marital portfolio, and a negotiated share of proceeds from vested stock and bonuses that had been credited to Andrew's compensation during the marriage. The settlement included spousal support sufficient to function as seed capital for a business relaunch, plus a contribution to legal fees. There were confidentiality clauses and mutual non-disparagement terms, practicalities that allowed both parties to step away without airing every detail. It was not a vindictive windfall. It was restitution in a form that gave Margaret something decisive: the ability to rebuild without immediate financial precarity. More important than the numbers was the structure it afforded her: autonomy, a workspace, and funds to hire help. The settlement recognized in negotiated terms that her intangible labor, the introductions, the late-night edits, the hosting that had smoothed deal-making, had material value. Margaret used the money with the same eye she once used for design. She found a modest corner office in an Austin building that let light in the way she liked, and she called back a former assistant who knew her work. She hired an associate designer and contracted with a freelance project manager. Her first commission was smaller than the large-scale institutional projects she had once taken on. It was, fittingly, a community space, a renovation of a local arts nonprofit where the budget was tight and the impact visible. She priced work ethically, took on a pro bono corner for a neighborhood group, and slowly rebuilt a roster of clients who appreciated a measured aesthetic and a steady hand. The work itself was a kind of therapy. Sketching floor plans, selecting fabrics, negotiating with vendors, these acts recentered her. She discovered that the muscle of running a business had not atrophied. It had been waiting, latent, for resources and the willingness to begin. The office's first wall carried photographs of projects she had completed in earlier years, and people began to navigate to her again with the gravity of those who remember a craftsman. She hired an apprentice from a local design school, and took care to structure mentorship the way she would have liked to have received it. There were quieter, equally important measures of recovery. She learned to sleep without the steady hum of suspicion slicing through the night. She cut down on coffee, started planting herbs in window boxes, and allowed herself to go to a summer concert with a friend without checking her email every 5 minutes. She met men and declined invites with a politeness that felt like a boundary rather than a wound. In conversation, she sometimes found herself laying out the mechanics of the past year with a calm inventory of facts, not for performance, but because the facts had become the scaffolding of a new story. Andrew, stripped of some of the shine of his role and admonished privately by the board, retreated from public-facing offices. The company's internal statement emphasized remediation and strengthening governance. Public commentary varied from sympathy to criticism. Vanessa faded from the sort of curated social feeds that once documented her ascent. There was no gloat in Margaret's life over their discomfiture, only a measured recognition that systems had shifted, and that consequence can sometimes work through institutional processes rather than personal ruin. The months after the settlement were not triumphant montage, but careful rebuilding. Margaret hired a small team and took on projects that aligned with a principle she now voiced when asked about the relaunch: to make work that mattered to clients and to protect the dignity of labor, both hers and the people who worked with her. She spoke at a local design forum once, not a podium about scandal, but about sustaining a creative practice through personal change. Her voice there was steady and mattered to people who read between the lines. The house she kept, part